November 4, 1947, Harlem, just after midnight. The back room of the Smokehouse Lounge was too quiet. The usual jazz from the bar downstairs was shut off. 5 men sat around a table. Not friends, rivals, each controlled a piece of the neighborhoods, action, numbers, protection, illicit goods. They were there because business was dying. Street wars were bad for the bottom line. Police raids were increasing, and a new, ambitious DA was making promises to clean up the city. The stakes were the future itself, to survive or to be wiped out. They were waiting for one man to break the deadlock. His name was Bumpy Johnson. He walked in 5 minutes late, no entourage, just him in his tailored suit. What they didn't realize was that the deadlock was already broken, in his favor. History books call him a gangster, but that night he was a diplomat, a strategist. They thought they were there to carve up territories. He was there to unite an empire. 2 weeks earlier, Harlem was a powder keg. The old Italian crews from downtown were pushing north, testing boundaries. The black neighborhood crews were too busy, fighting each other over scraps. To form a united front, Bumpy had respect. He had done time and kept his mouth shut. He had connections downtown, but he didn't have an army. The trigger was the beating of a young runner working for one of the men at that table, fast Eddie Malone. Eddie wanted blood. He was ready to start a war that would bring the whole city's heat down on them. Bumpy got a message to Eddie. Not a threat. Observation. Start that war, the message said, and you'll lose your corners to the Italians before the cops even show up. I have a better play. Bumpy requested a sit-down, not with Eddie alone, with all the major players. His plan was already in motion. It wasn't about muscle. It was about leverage. He had spent months understanding each man's weakness. Eddie Malone was hot-headed, but he was in debt to a loan shark from Jersey. Scholar Williams ran the numbers game. He was brilliant but paranoid, afraid of being usurped. Big Ben controlled the protection rackets. His weakness was his young, flashy wife and her expensive tastes. Piano, Joe had the speakeasies and after-hours spots. His supply of good whiskey was unreliable. And old man Preacher Jones, who had the respect of the street but was losing touch with the new ways. Bumpy worked in the shadows. He quietly settled Eddie's debt with the Jersey Shark, using an intermediary, leaving Eddie confused but relieved. He fed Scholar Williams just enough information, always correct, about small-time hustlers trying to skim, earning his trust as an intelligence source. He connected Big Ben's wife with a businessman who could supply her with luxury goods on extended credit, a leash made of silk. He secured a steady, high-quality whiskey shipment for Piano Joe through his downtown contacts, solving his biggest headache. To Preacher Jones, he showed deference publicly, asking for advice, making him feel like the wise elder of a new coalition. He solved their invisible problems, and in doing so, he owned a piece of their peace of mind. When the pressure from the Italian push became too much, Bumpy called the meeting. His message was simple. Come to the smokehouse, discuss the future, or be eaten alive one by one. They came, because each thought Bumpy was their silent partner, their solution. He had made them all dependent on his stability. So he walked into that silent room, looked at the 5 hardened faces. Eddie Malone spoke first, impatient. All right, Bumpy, we're here. What's this better play? Bumpy took a slow drag from his cigarette, put it out, and laid out a truth that changed Harlem forever. The better play, Bumpy said, his voice low and even, is to stop playing their game and start playing ours. He let that hang in the air. The smoke from his cigarette curled toward the ceiling. The Italians aren't our biggest problem. Our biggest problem is us. We're fighting for crumbs while they're planning the feast." Big Ben shifted in his chair. "Talk straight, Bumpy. What's the deal?" "The deal is a corporation," Bumpy said. "A syndicate. We pool our operations, numbers, protection, goods, one ledger, one distribution network. We stop hitting each other's runners. We stop undercutting prices. We present one face to the outside, to the cops, to the Italians downtown." Scholar Williams adjusted his glasses. His mind was already working on the numbers. One ledger means one person controls the books. "It means one person is responsible," Bumpy corrected him. "And that person isn't me. It's a board, you five. Each of you runs your department. But the profits get combined, then split fairly, based on contribution, not on who has the most guns on a street corner." Piano Joe scoffed. "Fairly? Who decides what's fair? You?" "The numbers decide," Bumpy said, looking at Scholar. "He keeps the real books, transparent to the board. You all see every dime in, every dime out. You call me out if a number smells wrong. I'll do the same." He was offering them oversight. He was offering them stability. He was offering to make their illegal businesses run like a legitimate corporation. It was a radical idea. Old Man Preacher Jones spoke for the first time, his voice like gravel. "And what's your cut, Bumpy? You ain't doing this for the good of Harlem. My cut is 10% off the top of the combined net," Bumpy said without flinching, "for brokering this peace, for being the buffer with downtown, for handling the high-level corruption that keeps the police and the DA's office off our backs. You handle the streets. I'll handle the suits. 10%. It was significant, but not outrageous. It was a price for a service they couldn't get anywhere else. Protection from the law itself. Eddie Malone was still stuck on the war, and my cousin's beating? We just forget that?" Bumpy turned to him. A cold, patient look. "No, Eddie, we don't forget. We monetize it. The crew that did it works for Tommy the Nose Scarpetti, a small-time Italian captain looking to prove himself. If we go to war with him, we waste men, money, and attract headlines. If we make his operation unprofitable, if every shipment he tries to run gets hijacked, if every dice game he sets up gets raided by cops, we've tipped off his own bosses, we'll break him, and we will take his territory. Not with bullets, with business." That was the second revelation. He wasn't selling peace. He was selling a more efficient, more ruthless form of war, a strategic one. He had a plan for each of their objections because he had studied them. He knew Scholar needed order and logic. He knew Big Ben responded to clear hierarchy and profit. He knew Piano Joe wanted reliable supply chains. He knew Preacher Jones needed to feel respected in the new order. And he knew Eddie needed a channel for his aggression that served the bottom line. For the next hour, he laid out the structure. Districts would become departments. Street captains would become foremen. Violence would become a last resort, a sanctioned tool, not the first option. Disputes would be settled in a council, not in an alley. It was a vision of criminal empire they had never imagined. It was professional. The tension in the room didn't disappear. It transformed. From hostility between each other to a fierce, calculating focus on Bumpy's proposal. They started asking questions, not challenges, but clarifications. How would collections work? How would new territories be approved? They were negotiating. And by negotiating, they were already buying in. Bumpy listened more than he talked. He let them convince themselves. He let Scholar Williams explain the tax benefits of pooled capital. He let Big Ben outline a better protection racket structure. Bumpy just guided. Finally, Preacher Jones nodded slowly. A man can't argue with sense or with survival. That was the signal. One by one, they gave a grunt of agreement. A handshake. It wasn't friendship, it was a merger. The meeting at the Smokehouse Lounge ended not with a celebration, but with quiet orders. Each man left to dismantle his old, rivalrous structure and build his piece of the new machine. But here's what history won't tell you about that night. The real masterstroke wasn't the Syndicate. It was the insurance policy Bumpy had already put in place. Weeks before that meeting, Bumpy had visited each of their top lieutenants. Not the leaders, but the number 2 men. The ambitious ones. He'd offered them a simple vision. A bigger pie means bigger slices for everyone. Help your boss see the light, and your position becomes more important. You become a manager, not just a thug. He had secured their loyalty in advance, not by bribing them to betray their bosses, but by promising them a better future within the new system. If any of the 5 leaders had refused the deal that night, Bumpy knew their own right-hand men would have pressured them or replaced them. He was never in that room alone. He had the ghosts of their own organizations sitting with him. The following week, the change on the streets was subtle but profound. Fights between local crews stopped. Shakedowns became standardized fees. The numbers game became more efficient, with better payouts that attracted more customers. And when Tommy the Nose Scarpetti tried to move into a Harlem market, his trucks were mysteriously hijacked. His gambling dens were raided by perfectly informed police. His collection men found themselves outmuscled by a suddenly unified front. He was ruined within a month, not by a bloody war, but by a coordinated economic siege. His own bosses gave us his territory as a peace offering. To stop the bad luck from spreading, Bumpy's 10% made him a wealthy man, but his real power was the structure he built. He became the arbitrator, the court of final appeal. The man who could make a problem disappear not with a bullet, but with a phone call. The 5 bosses grew richer and more secure than ever before, but they also became dependent on the system, on the peace, on Bumpy as the glue holding it all together. They didn't work for him. They worked within the system he designed, and that was a far more powerful form of control. Anyone could kill a man. It took a strategist to make 50 gangs willingly, put down their weapons and pick up a ledger. The structure held for years. Harlem didn't become a utopia, but it became a stable, lucrative enterprise. Bumpy's Syndicate, which the street called the Council, operated with a chilling efficiency. Disputes were settled every Thursday in a nondescript office above a funeral parlor. Bumpy presided. He listened to evidence, heard arguments, then ruled. His rulings were final, and they were respected because they were logical. They protected the business, not personal egos. A captain skimming money? He wasn't killed. He was demoted. His territory given to his more loyal lieutenant. A lesson in consequences that spread faster than any bullet. A new independent crew trying to set up shop? They weren't crushed immediately. They were given an offer. Join the structure, pay a franchise fee, and enjoy protection and supply. Most accepted. The few who refused found their operations mysteriously collapsing. Suppliers dried up. Customers disappeared. They were frozen out. Bumpy's real power was the threat of being cut off from the system. It was economic exile, a death sentence for a criminal's income. By 1952, the council controlled not just Harlem, but influence in parts of the Bronx and Brooklyn. Over 50 crews, formerly independent or rivals, now worked within the framework. They didn't love Bumpy, but they respected the peace and the profits. He was the necessary evil, the constitutional monarch of their underworld. But power always creates new challenges. And the greatest challenge came from within. Big Ben, the protection racket boss, started getting greedy. The structure had made him wealthy, but it also capped his ambition. He couldn't just muscle into a new neighborhood anymore. He had to get approval from the council. He began to resent Bumpy's 10%. He called it a tribute in private, a tax on his success. He started making quiet moves, meeting with a few younger, ambitious captains from other departments, suggesting that the old guard, meaning Bumpy and Preacher, Jones, was holding them back, that they could cut out the middleman. He was careful. He never openly challenged Bumpy. He just planted seeds of doubt. "Imagine your full cut, not 90%, he'd whisper over drinks. "The Italian families downtown don't have a single boss taking a cut like that. They have a commission, equal partners." Bumpy knew. Of course he knew. His insurance policy, the network of lieutenants, was still in place. He heard every whisper, but he didn't act. He watched. He let Big Ben's ambition grow, let him feel confident, because Bumpy understood the second rule of control. You must allow a threat to emerge, and then you must crush it so completely that it becomes a legend, a warning etched into the memory of everyone who remains. The opportunity came over a shipment. Piano Joe's whiskey supply from Canada was intercepted by the Coast Guard, a major loss. In the old days, this would have started a war of blame. Now it was a business problem to be solved at the council. At the meeting, Piano Joe was furious, suspecting a leak. Big Ben saw his chance. "See," Ben said, slamming his hand on the table, "this is the problem. We're too centralized. One leak, one arrest, and the whole operation feels it. We're vulnerable because we all depend on one system, on one man's connections." The room went still. It was the closest anyone had come to a direct challenge. Bumpy, sitting at the head, just steepled his fingers. "What's your alternative, Ben?" "Decentralize," Ben said, emboldened by the silence. "Let each department handle its own supply lines, its own security. We share intelligence, but not profits. We're a federation, not a corporation." It was a direct attack on the core of Bumpy's power, the pooled profits and his role as the central nerve. Scholar Williams, the numbers man, pushed his glasses up. "Statistically, that increases risk and cost for all of us. The pooled capital is what gives us leverage with suppliers and other institutions," Ben smirked. "Institutions Bumpy controls. Maybe we need new institutions." That was the line. The challenge was now open. Bumpy nodded slowly, as if considering it. "A fair point. Change is necessary to survive. Let's put it to a vote. Next week, each boss gets one vote. We'll decide the future of our enterprise." He agreed to a vote. He legitimized the challenge. To everyone in the room, it looked like a sign of weakness. Maybe Bumpy was losing his grip. The week that followed was a silent storm. Big Ben worked the phones, offering promises, cutting side deals. He was sure he had the votes. He had Eddie Malone's support. Eddie always craved action over stability. He thought he had Piano Joe, who was angry about his lost shipment. He assumed the young, ambitious captains would pressure their bosses. What he didn't know was that Bumpy was also working, but not on votes. Bumpy met with two people. First, the lieutenant who ran Big Ben's most profitable protection district, a man named Carter who was tired of Ben's arrogance and had always reported directly to Bumpy. Bumpy showed him numbers. "If Ben's plan goes through, your district's expenses for muscle and bribes go up 30%. Your personal take shrinks. Under the current system, you're guaranteed a salary and a bonus. Which future do you want?" Carter's loyalty shifted instantly. It wasn't about betrayal, it was about business. Second, Bumpy went to see the newly promoted, notoriously ruthless, federal agent in charge of organized crime for New York, a man with political ambitions who needed a big win. Bumpy didn't offer a bribe. He offered a gift-wrapped trophy. He provided detailed, anonymous ledgers, not of the council's core operations, but of Big Ben's private, off-the-books side hustles, operations Ben was running without paying the 10% to the Syndicate, tax evasion, names, dates, shipment manifests. It was the perfect target for an ambitious Fed, a high-profile gangster, acting alone, flouting the very system that kept the peace. Taking him down would look like a victory for law and order, without destabilizing the entire city's underworld and creating a messy war. The day of the vote arrived. The atmosphere in the funeral parlor office was electric with tension. Big Ben walked in smiling. He thought he was walking in to become the new king. Bumpy opened the meeting. "Before we vote," he said, his voice calm, "there's a matter of breach of contract. Our charter states all operations flow through the central ledger. All profits are shared. It seems one of us has been running a separate enterprise." He didn't look at Ben. He just laid the photocopied pages of Ben's private ledger on the table. The same pages the Fed now had. Ben's face went pale. "That's a lie. Those are forgeries." "Are they?" Bumpy said, finally looking at him. "Then you won't mind if your man Carter explains the routing numbers. Or if we ask your warehouse manager on 128th Street about the trucks that come every Thursday." He knew everything. He had turned Ben's own people. Before Ben could sputter a reply, Bumpy delivered the masterstroke. He spoke not to Ben, but to the room. "The vote is canceled. There is no alternative structure, because the alternative is chaos, and chaos brings the kind of attention that ends us all." He turned his gaze back to Ben. It was no longer the look of a chairman. It was the look of a judge passing sentence. "You're out, Ben. You violated the peace. You don't get a vote. You don't get a territory. You keep the cash you've hidden. And you get on a train to Miami tonight. And you never come back." It wasn't a request. It was an edict. Ben looked around the table for support, for the allies he thought he had. Eddie Malone looked away. Piano Joe studied the table. Scholar Williams adjusted his ledger. Preacher Jones just shook his head slowly. Their faces showed no outrage, only cold calculation. Ben had become a liability. Bumpy had just proven he was a god who could see every secret and strike with the force of the law itself. Ben was alone, exiled not by force, but by consensus, by the very system he tried to break. He left the room that day. He took the train to Miami. He died years later, a bitter, small-time gambler, telling stories about the empire he almost owned. Nobody in Harlem ever tried to challenge the structure again. The legend of that meeting grew. They said Bumpy had the FBI on his payroll. They said he could see through walls. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. He had built a system so perfectly balanced that it defended itself. He didn't need to be a tyrant. He just needed to be the architect. And an architect is always 3 steps ahead, because he knows where every beam rests, and which one to remove to make the whole structure fall. The exile of Big Ben was the final brick in the foundation. After that, the council wasn't just a business arrangement, it was the law. Bumpy's word became absolute, but he rarely had to give an order. The system he designed generated its own gravity. It pulled everyone in and kept them in orbit. By the mid-1950s, the operation was so smooth it was almost boring. Profits were steady. Violence was rare and surgical. Police attention faded to a low, manageable hum, thanks to the carefully maintained corruption pipeline Bumpy managed. He became a ghost in the machine, a name whispered more than seen. But a strategist's work is never done. The real threat to power isn't always a rival with a gun. Sometimes it's an idea, A new generation that doesn't remember the chaos, that only sees the structure as restrictive. The next challenge came from the young, from the street soldiers who hadn't been in the back room of the smokehouse lounge, who only knew the peace and chafed under its rules. A new name started circulating: the Wolves. A loose alliance of enforcers and runners from different crews. They were young, hungry, and saw the older bosses as fat and comfortable. They wanted flash. They wanted faster money. They wanted respect on their terms, not through some corporate ladder of crime. Their leader was a kid they called Quick. Not because he was fast, but because he was impatient. He had a sharp mind but no memory. He didn't know what it cost to build the peace he was living in. Quick's strategy was clever. He didn't attack the council directly. He exploited its rules. The council had strict protocols. No drug dealing in school zones, no excessive violence that draws headlines, no messing with certain protected businesses. Quick's wolves would identify a small, council-protected business whose owner was behind on his fees. They'd offer him a deal, pay them a smaller cut, and they'd handle his protection. If he refused, they'd vandalize his store in ways that looked random, not like organized crime. They were creating chaos under the radar, making the council look weak and inefficient. Then they started skimming from the numbers runners. Tiny amounts spread across many collectors. A tax on the tax. It was a needle, not a knife. Hard to detect, frustrating to track. They were testing the system's pressure points, not with a hammer, but with 1,000 little needles. The bosses brought the problem to the council. Eddie Malone was livid. "These pups need to be put down. Let me handle it, Bumpy. A few examples and they'll fall in line." Bumpy listened. He shook his head. "If you make examples, you make martyrs. You turn a nuisance into a cause. The young ones will rally around their dead friends. The streets will talk, and talk brings heat." Scholar Williams agreed. The financial loss is currently negligible, a rounding error. A violent overreaction is a greater risk to our bottom line. "So we do nothing?" Eddie snapped. "We observe," Bumpy said. "We understand their network. Every gang of kids has a hierarchy. They have dreams. We need to know what Quick wants more than money." Bumpy's move was, again, indirect. He didn't send enforcers. He sent a woman. Her name was Lena. She ran a high-stakes underground card game that catered to politicians, judges, and high-level criminals. She was elegant, discreet, and knew more secrets than the police commissioner. She was also, quietly, one of Bumpy's most valuable intelligence assets. Lena started showing up at the bars and clubs where the wolves hung out, not as a patron, as a legend. She'd lose a deliberately large bet to Quick in a backroom poker game. She'd compliment his nerve. She'd ask in an offhand way what a young man with his talents planned to do with his life. Stay a street wolf forever, or become the one who feeds the pack. She planted a seed, the seed of ambition, the idea that there was a bigger game. Meanwhile, Bumpy used the council's machinery to apply silent pressure. The wolves found their usual fences for stolen goods suddenly unwilling to buy. The garages where they stored their cars were inspected by the city. Small but constant inconveniences, making the street life harder, while the promise of something bigger glittered in the distance. Lena reported back to Bumpy. "Quick is smart. He's arrogant. He doesn't want to be a boss. He wants to be a king, like you. But he thinks the way to do it is to tear the old kingdom down." Bumpy understood. Quick saw the structure as a cage. He didn't see it as the source of his food, water, and safety. So Bumpy designed a new cage, one with gold bars. He had Lena set up a meeting, not with Bumpy, with Scholar Williams. The message was, the council sees enterprise, even in dissent. There's a proposal, a new venture, for young, aggressive talent, with its own profit stream, its own autonomy. Answer the call or be a footnote. Quick, flattered, and curious, agreed to meet Scholar in a neutral location. Scholar laid out the deal, crisp and businesslike. The council is expanding. New markets uptown. It requires a separate, mobile unit, younger faces, to handle acquisitions and negotiations. The unit would be yours to lead. You report to the council, but you operate independently. You get 20% of the net from your operations. You recruit your own team from your wolves. The rest of the wolves fall in line with their original crews or are disbanded. It was a classic Bumpy move. Co-option, not destruction. He was offering Quick a kingdom, but a vassal kingdom. A title, but within the hierarchy. A taste of real power, with the council's machinery behind him. Quick saw the title. He saw the 20%. He saw a chance to be more than just a street thug. He saw a path to becoming a boss without a war. He took the deal. The wolves were dissolved overnight. Their most loyal and dangerous members became Quick's new acquisitions team. The rest drifted back into the regular crews, their rebellious spirit broken not by violence, but by the ultimate street seduction. Promotion? Quick was now inside the system, and the system began to absorb him. He had budgets. He had deadlines. He had to file reports to Scholar Williams. His wild energy was channeled into profitable, council-sanctioned activities. Within a year, he was arguing for more resources in council meetings, complaining about the old bosses being too cautious. He had become part of the establishment he hated, and he loved it. Bumpy had turned the leader of the rebellion into its most effective defender. He had used the young man's ambition as a leash. The legend of Bumpy grew again. They said he could turn your own desires against you, that he could see the crack in your soul and pour gold into it until it sealed shut, trapping you inside. The final test of his empire wasn't from the streets. It was from the highest office in the state. A new governor was elected on a clean-up New York platform. He appointed a special prosecutor with a blank check and a mandate to break organized crime. This was different from local cops on the take. This was political. This was an existential threat. The prosecutor's name was Carl Finch. He was idealistic, relentless, and he didn't take bribes. He started from the top, targeting the Italian families. But his gaze was moving uptown. For the first time, the council faced a threat that couldn't be bought, intimidated or outmaneuvered in back rooms. Finch wanted headlines, and the collapse of Harlem's shadow government would be a front-page story for weeks. The bosses were nervous. Even Preacher Jones looked worried. "They can't arrest us all," he muttered. "But they only need one who talks." The air in the council room was thick with fear. They were successful businessmen of the underworld, and now the real world was changing the rules. Bumpy sat through the panic. He let them voice their fears. Then he spoke, his voice cutting through the noise. "We don't fight him," Bumpy said. "We help him." They stared at him as if he'd gone mad. Bumpy explained. "Finch needs a victory. A big, public victory to satisfy his voters and his governor. We give him one." His plan was audacious. It was the ultimate strategic sacrifice. He would give Finch Big Benny's old lieutenant, Carter, the man who had betrayed Ben. Carter had gotten sloppy, greedy. He was running a small-time heroin operation on the side, a direct violation of council rules. He was a perfect target, high enough to be impressive, but isolated enough that taking him down wouldn't touch the core council. The council would leak Carter's location, his operation ledgers, everything, to Finch's office anonymously. They would make sure the arrest was spectacular, with press coverage. Finch would get his trophy, his headlines about shattering a major Harlem narcotics ring. He would be a hero. And in the flood of that victory, the quiet, efficient, and seemingly mundane operations of the rest of the council would remain invisible. A solved crime is a closed file. Finch would move on to the next target, his ambition temporarily satisfied. Bumpy was offering a limb to save the body. They voted. It was unanimous. The plan worked perfectly. Carter was arrested in a dramatic midnight raid. The papers ate it up. Finch held a press conference triumphant. He never looked north of Carter. The council and Bumpy's empire remained intact. It had survived youth, greed, and now the law, because Bumpy understood the deepest secret of power. Sometimes, to stay in control, you have to give up control. You have to sacrifice a piece to save the whole, and you have to be the one who chooses which piece. That's how an empire lasts, not by being impenetrable, but by being adaptable, by being a living thing that sheds its own skin when threatened, and emerges stronger. The man who builds that isn't just a king, he's an architect of reality. And architects think in blueprints, not in battles. By 1959, the system was a well-oiled machine. But machines need maintenance. And the greatest wear isn't on the gears, it's on the minds of the men who run them. Complacency is the silent killer of empires. Bumpy knew this. He saw the signs. Scholar Williams was more focused on his legitimate real estate ventures. Preacher Jones was slowing down, content to be a figurehead. Piano Joe had become a connoisseur, more interested in vintage wine than his clubs. Even Eddie Malone had mellowed, his fire banked by steady wealth. They were comfortable, and comfort is the enemy of vigilance. Bumpy needed a reset, a controlled shock to the system. Not from the outside, from within his own design. He began, subtly, to create scarcity. A key supplier for the numbers operation had a dispute and was cut off, not by Bumpy directly, but through a chain of whispers he orchestrated. The flow of pristine betting slips slowed. Payouts were delayed by a day, then two. In the protection business, a few independent trucking companies suddenly refused to pay the standard fee. They were small, but their defiance was public. The street captains grumbled. Why wasn't the council crushing them? Bumpy let the pressure build. Let the bosses feel a vague unease. Profits were still strong, but the machine was making a new, unfamiliar noise. Then he introduced the catalyst. A new player arrived from Detroit, a man named Roland Hayes. He was polished, Midwestern, with connections to auto unions and a reputation for modernizing operations. He wasn't a street thug. He was a corporate raider for the underworld. Hayes reached out discreetly to each council boss, one by one. His pitch was seductive. To Scholar Williams, he talked about liquidity and offshore banking, things the council's old-fashioned ledger system couldn't handle. To Piano Joe, he promised a direct line to European liquor suppliers, cutting out 3 middlemen. To Eddie Malone, he spoke of new, lucrative sports betting networks that spanned the country. He offered each of them a private partnership, a side deal, a way to leverage their council position for personal, exponential gain outside of the structure. He was offering them a back door out of Bumpy's system, and he was doing it with Bumpy's silent permission, because Roland Hayes was Bumpy's creation. A ghost from his past called in for one final performance. Hayes owed Bumpy a favor from a decade ago, a life debt, and now Bumpy was cashing it in. Hayes's job wasn't to steal the empire. It was to remind the bosses why they needed it. The bosses, comfortable and secretly bored, were tempted. They met Hayes in secret. They entertained his ideas. They began to dream again of being kings of their own castles, not department heads in Bumpy's corporation. But the dreams came with fear. Leaving the council meant exposure. It meant going back to the Wild West. It meant possibly facing Bumpy's wrath. The unease turned to paranoia. Eddie suspected Scholar was making a move. Piano Joe thought Eddie was getting greedy. The unified front began to crack under the weight of private ambition. Bumpy watched it all, a conductor letting the orchestra play a discordant tune. He let the tension reach a breaking point. Then he called a council meeting. The air was thick with unspoken betrayals. Bumpy didn't mention Hayes. He didn't accuse anyone. He simply laid out a new set of numbers. Productivity is down 7%. He said, his voice flat. Morale in the ranks is low. Small-time independents are testing our borders. Our machine is rusting. He looked at each of them. We have a choice. We can oil the gears, or we can let it seize up and break. And when it breaks, everything we built gets washed away in the blood we spent a decade avoiding. He was speaking to their fear. The fear Hayes had made real. The fear of losing what they had. Then Bumpy proposed the oil, a complete operational overhaul. New suppliers he had already vetted. A profit-sharing bonus for street-level soldiers to boost loyalty. A new internal security department to quietly eliminate external influencers. A phrase he let hang in the air. It was a plan to modernize, to tighten, to reassert control, and it required their unanimous vote and full commitment. Faced with the chaos Hayes represented, and the clear, authoritative path Bumpy offered, their private ambitions crumbled. One by one they agreed, relieved even. They voted to reinvest, to recommit to the system. The crack in the foundation was sealed, not with force, but with a renewed collective will. The next day, Roland Hayes left New York as quietly as he came. His job was done. He had made the cage feel like a prison, so that when Bumpy offered to remodel it, they thanked him. Bumpy had used their latent greed to remind them of their fear, and he used that fear to secure their loyalty for another decade. He didn't just manage the business. He managed their psychology. He was the steady hand on the wheel, but he was also the one who gently rocked the boat just enough to make everyone seasick, and grateful when he steadied it again. The lesson was embedded in the legend. You never challenge Bumpy, because the challenge you think is coming from outside might be his hand moving in the shadows. He didn't just defend his empire. He stage-managed its crises. He was the playwright, the director, and the lead actor in the never-ending play of power. And in that play, everyone else had a role, but only he knew the full script. Bumpy Johnson died in his bed in 1968. A heart attack. No drama, no police raid. The funeral was massive. Politicians, judges, cops, and street legends stood side by side. A strange, silent tribute to the architect of their shared reality. In the days after, the city held its breath, waiting for the chaos, for the power grab, for the empire to shatter into 50 warring pieces. It never happened. The machine kept running. The council met the following Thursday as usual. Scholar Williams presided. The ledgers were balanced. The distributions went out. Because Bumpy hadn't built an empire dependent on a king. He had built an ecosystem, a set of rules, incentives, and consequences so perfectly balanced that it became self-sustaining. His final master strategy wasn't a move on the board. It was the design of the board itself. He made the system more valuable than any single person in it, including himself. The bosses stayed loyal to the peace, because the peace was their wealth. The street soldiers stayed in line because the structure was their career ladder. Even the cops and politicians preferred the predictable, quiet corruption of the council to the bloody uncertainty of a gang war. Bumpy's secret wasn't fear, it was clarity. He showed every man his place in the machine and the cost of breaking it. He turned chaos into a corporation, ambition into a managed resource. So, when he was gone, the machine didn't falter. It proved his greatest theory. True power isn't about being the strongest man in the room. It's about building the room so strong it doesn't need you anymore. He wasn't 3 steps ahead. He was the one who laid the path. And long after he was gone, everyone was still walking it. That's how you control 50 gangs. You don't rule them. You make them need the rules,